Licensed video games tend to be some of the worst received titles on any given console, and it's not without good reason. Most of these titles are made just to capitalize on a popular IP, with the actual mechanical and gameplay aspects of it being put on the back burner. These titles then tend to lack any sort of actual mechanical depth, though this doesn't always have to be the case. After all, one of the single most highly praised titles of all time is a licensed game. Obviously, it's important for the IP to be represented first and foremost, but a game still needs to be mechanically sound and playable in order for it to actually be fun. This is true for all games, obviously, but the former is especially important for licensed titles as they're representing an overall brand that transcends just a game series or an individual title. So even if one of these titles does have in-depth mechanics and it can actually provide you with a lot of fun, if it doesn't do a good enough job of representing the intellectual property, then the final product might still be poorly received. How fun a licensed title can potentially be directly correlates to how well the property lends itself to a video game format. Looking back on the Cartoon Network titles we played on the Gamecube, you get a lot of the usual garbage that's expected of these sorts of games, but a couple of them actually ended up being legitimately pretty good. Some were just straight up better, more fun games to play, while others did a better job of representing their actual IPs and their characters. Ed, Edd and Eddy The Misadventures would fall into this latter category, as basically the whole game through feels like an extended episode of the show. You spend the whole game switching between the three Eds Sonic Hero style, getting into whatever kind of trouble they can think of. The show's characters populate the cul-de-sac as well as the surrounding areas, which are all used as a sort of hub world for the levels, with individual levels serving the same role as individual episodes in the show, each of which being full of callbacks to the original series. All the characters are well represented in their dialogue and in their behavior and in the way that they're animated, though the actual overall graphical fidelity of it, even for its time, leaves a lot to be desired. That said, Ed, Edd and Eddy was already kind of a weird, wobbly looking show, so it doesn't actually look too bad, at least not compared to some of the other titles. The Powerpuff Girls Relish Rampage had a similar visual quality, though it was much less vibrant and much less animated. The game, while colorful, looks just very flat and lifeless because of this, but it is worth noting that Relish Rampage is the earliest release among all of these, so you do have to cut it a little bit of slack. Unlike the Misadventures, the Powerpuff Girls completely drops the ball when it comes to representing its IP. You'll see a lot of familiar faces and get plenty of jokes as you're playing through the title, but it all just comes off as very forced. And given the fact that basically all gameplay revolves around just flying from point A to point B with maybe a little bit of backtracking and combat in between, at no point does it feel like you're ever sitting through an episode of the Powerpuff Girls. Everything feels very out of place. Sure, most of what the Powerpuff Girls do in the show is fly around and beat up bad guys, but there is always some sort of solid plot that it revolves around. They tried to do that with the overall mission objectives, but without any variety in gameplay, it all just got really repetitive and really boring much faster than it probably should have. Teen Titans posed a very similar problem, in that it took the idea of the Teen Titans being an action, combat-oriented series, and decided to just run with that idea, also ignoring any sort of variety in gameplay. It's basically just an arcade-style beat-em-up with an emphasis on multiplayer, and that's sort of all there is to it. Teen Titans, being a comic book series, had a lot of lore that it could have worked off even if they just stuck with the stuff that they adapted into the TV series, but they pretty much just ignored all of that and just went with a cliche, oh no, it's a video game type of story. And even then, they didn't even use the one character in the TV series that could have logically been behind something like that. Instead, they just submit to the fact that they are in a video game and you, the player, are the bad guy for making them participate in it. The game could have still been decent and fun to play regardless, but its emphasis on couch co-op was so strong that the actual single-player experience suffered because of it. The companion AI is basically useless, and because of that you end up spending way longer on levels than you would if you just had somebody to play with. There's nothing wrong with emphasizing multiplayer, but when your single-player experience suffers for it, then it just gives players another reason to look at the game in a negative light. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy had a similar emphasis on multiplayer, given the fact that it was a literal arcade-style fighter, but even so it was able to provide you with a fun and express single-player arcade mode basically, what it calls its story mode. There isn't much of a story to be told. Basically, Billy just gets into Grim's trunk again, he unleashes these evil mojo balls, and they drive everybody crazy to the point of violence. You fight your way through an actually fairly large roster of characters, until you reach that big eyeball brain alien from that one episode, And that's it, that's your story mode. Like I said, the game is structured like a typical arcade fighter, but it actually plays more akin to something like PlayStation All-Stars. Characters have a health meter with multiple lives, and your job is just to get them down to that final life and then finish them off with an ultimate attack. It's not the best mechanic, and it can similarly make fights drag on a little bit longer than they need to, but assuming you're a little kid who sucks at video games, it's probably reassuring to know that you always have a chance to turn it around even at the last second. Billy and Mandy is definitely on the better looking side of these games as well, having the same sort of liveliness and animation that Ed, Edd n Eddy did, but like Teen Titans and the Powerpuff Girls, suffers from its lack of variety in gameplay, and again doesn't really feel at all like the intellectual property. It just has the characters crammed in there making too many forced jokes to remind you that hey, this is Billy and Mandy. The only thing that is true to the actual IP is the overwhelming amount of gruesome violence, people getting hit with axes, getting caught on fire, being thrown into spike pits. All of that stuff is definitely on brand with Billy and Mandy. And speaking of violence, Samurai Jack was another title whose main appeal was definitely its action. Since pretty much the entirety of the enemies in Samurai Jack as a series were all of a robotic nature, or at least an inorganic nature, the level of actual violence that could be shown was much greater than these other series. This is all to say that action and violence are in a way crucial to Samurai Jack as an intellectual property, and Shadow of Aku definitely delivers. You could say it's the Dark Souls of Cartoon Network licensed titles, but it actually plays more like Prince of Persia. It's heavy on the same sort of cinematics that the cartoon was, creating a similar sort of serious tone and ambience, all the while giving you a wide range of movement and combat actions that, at the cost of sounding a little bit cliche, really do make you feel like Samurai Jack. Visually, everything looks pretty good and is very much in line with Samurai Jack's world and its aesthetic, but like the Powerpuff Girls, there's a certain flatness to it. The movements and animations, especially during cutscenes, are a lot more robotic, a little more static than something like Ed, Edd n Eddy or even Billy and Mandy. But given that the series tends to have a more somber and serious tone overall, it doesn't really lose as much from this as the Powerpuff Girls did. Shadow of Aku's major weakness, then, is the series' own abstract nature. There was always a consistent theme and even what you could call running gags with some of the recurring characters, most notably Aku, who despite being the supreme evil bad guy of the series tended to be more often than not the comical relief as well.
Extra thick!
But the tone from just one episode to the next could shift dramatically. So again, while it does succeed in making you feel like Samurai Jack, the game itself doesn't really feel like an episode or even an extension of the series. By comparison then, something like The Kids Next Door, whose TV series already uses an isolated mission structure for its episodes, gives the player an immediate sense of familiarity. The game cuts you in with a quick mission briefing just like the ones at the beginning of every episode, and right away you get to see the main cast of characters hanging out in the treehouse and showing off what are probably the best graphics out of all of these games. The overall quality of models and such isn't very different from the ones we saw in Billy and Mandy and even way back with Powerpuff Girls, but the animation and especially the overlaying textures on these models do a really great job of maintaining the integrity of the characters. They easily look the most like their cartoon counterparts. They're simple without seeming overly flat like the models in Billy and Mandy and Powerpuff Girls, but also not so stretchy and bulbous that they end up coming out looking like weird jelly monsters. Gameplay is a bit of a mixed bag with this one. It's primarily an action platformer, but depending on the specific K&D operative that you're playing as, gameplay will vary slightly. Or in the case of playing as number 2, gameplay will shift dramatically. While most missions will see you running and jumping through stages, number 2's missions will see you piloting some sort of aircraft, in more of an old school bullet hell style. This alone definitely blows the other games out of the water in terms of just variety and gameplay styles, but this overall form factor with this specific IP I think does work against it, and that is kind of its only major flaw to me. While there is some benefit in incorporating multiple playstyles through the use of multiple distinct characters, I feel like the game does suffer by never having multiple K&D operatives together, and how the fact that the K&D treehouse doesn't serve as a hub world that you can explore is just god-awful too, because that's one of the coolest parts of the IP. Going back to how bad Teen Titans was, the fact that you never get to explore Titan's Tower or really get to engage with any of the more lore and story-heavy aspects of the series, of the IP, in a similar way it makes it feel like it's just lacking more so than it already is. It's bad enough that the game is repetitive and already not that fun to play, but when you omit certain features, certain characters, especially in a title like that, it's almost insulting because you can't help but feel like something is missing. Either way, good or bad, all of these games have very, very simple plots, because at the end of the day, they are still just cash grabs. But again, as we've already seen with games like Nightfire and The Simpsons Hit and Run, that doesn't necessarily have to equal a game being bad. Like I said, in the case of games like Samurai Jack and Kids Next Door, I'd argue that these are actually very fun, very good games overall, regardless of their IP. Those two, alongside the Misadventures, are easily the best titles out of the 6. Again, they're the best representatives of their IP, they offer the most robust gameplay overall, and even with something like Ed, Edd n Eddy, which is a little bit lacking compared to Samurai Jack and KND, it displayed a good sense of level design, implementing even a good amount of verticality, which isn't something you saw in a lot of games back in that day, especially not a licensed title. The only other metric you can really judge these games on, especially given that it was a big selling point at the time, is the bonus content that they offer you. This is another area where KND really shines, as it ties its unlockables directly to its collectibles in-game, with most of those unlockable features being things that you can actually use during gameplay, like alternate costumes or upgraded weapons and abilities. In particular, I really like the possession ability that you can unlock on Kids Next Door by beating the game. You can effectively take over the body of any non-boss NPC and just walk around as that character, but the best part about it is once you've possessed them, you can release the possession and they just straight up die right there. It makes gameplay kind of redundant because you can just teleport and insta-kill basically everything. But given that you have to beat the game to unlock this ability anyway, it's fine. It makes replaying it and doing all the extra stuff that much easier and that much funner. You can also unlock some FNV, as well as like some special modes where you can pilot around some of the enemy boss NPCs and things like that, but the majority of it is just alternate costumes and upgraded weapons. By comparison, none of the unlockables for the other games really even compare. You can unlock a couple of bonus stages for Ed, Edd n Eddy, one of which takes you back to that big cardboard city that they built in that one episode, except you're playing as Ed dressed up in that big monster costume from the episode where he's stealing everybody's Chunky Puffs and chewing them up and sticking them to his wall with some cereal, which is like some legit serial killer behavior now that I'm saying it out loud. But for the most part, you'll just be unlocking some full motion video clips, one of which is literally just a trailer for the Misadventures. Why you need to advertise the game you're already playing within the game itself, who knows? Which Billy and Mandy also just gives you FMV for the Misadventures, so I guess they really wanted people to play Ed, Edd n Eddy. Samurai Jack and Teen Titans only give you like some still images, most of which aren't even worth unlocking because they require multiple playthroughs of the game or whatever else, leaving just the Powerpuff Girls, which gives you the least amount of unlockables, but they're actually on the better end of them. Rather than just giving you more FMV or promotional materials, Powerpuff Girls goes the route of actually giving you a few minigames, and these are all very simple. They're basically just Pac-Man, Frogger, and Space Invaders ripoffs. But hey, it's extra content and it's pretty fun to play. I definitely wasted a good 45 minutes doing that Pac-Man Mojo Jojo game, so. Either way, even at their very worst, these games will still give you a pretty good nostalgia kick, which is pretty much their only possible appeal in the modern day. Kids Next Door is easily the shining star among all these games, but Samurai Jack is still really fun to play. And even if it's a little bit lacking mechanically, The Misadventures is fun and charming enough that if you want to power through the game, it will at least entertain you in the same way that the show does. You could also definitely have some cheap fun playing Billy and Mandy with your friends, but it's probably not worth playing the single player over and over again. Similarly, it's probably not worth playing Teen Titans or the Powerpuff Girls at all. I guess the multiplayer aspect of Teen Titans could bring a little life to it if you want to do the whole couch co-op thing, but the game just has no backbone story-wise or anything else.
You sent us that video game and then trapped us in it. Now tell us how to get out.
So if you missed out on these titles, or if you're just looking to recapture some of your childhood, these games are definitely more than playable for the most part. Just don't expect them to give you any more than 30 minutes or an hour of actual fun before they start to get repetitive and boring. Thankfully, if you still want more than that, we already suffered through the game so that you don't have to. If you want to see more of what these games have to offer and just don't have the will to put yourself through them, you can always just go back and watch our gameplay series in which we cover basically all of them in depth. We also dig a little deeper into the series themselves, so there's a little more nostalgia for you there too. Anyway, definitely play Billy and Mandy, play Candy, Teen Titans fucking stinks. Please give me money. Goodbye.